Life is often not what we expect. Our life, despite what the ads may tell us, and our problems are not solved by the next product or the next service that we could buy. Even the wealthiest among us are still plagued and wounded by the difficulties and wrongs of this life. A friend dies suddenly in an accident. You hear of an abusive marriage and suffering children. A business partner is committing fraud. And all the tests come back positive and the person is sick. When faced with these kinds of realities, or perhaps just the announcement this morning, we may have cliches like, we got to be strong, or things will get better, but these are totally inadequate. If that's all we have to offer as the Church of Jesus Christ to one another and to a hurting world, well, then we should keep our mouths shut. But the good news is that is not all we have to offer, and really that all that's been offered to us. This morning, I want to look at how God's love draws near in a very broken world. And to do that, we're going to be looking at Isaiah chapter 40, verses 1 to 11. So you can follow along with me there. There's likely a Bible in the pew in front of you. Isaiah is before Jeremiah and Ezekiel, and if you just flip through the first half of your Bible, you'll probably stumble on one of those. However, before we settle into Isaiah chapter 40, I want to go back a little bit further to give you the full story. So I'm going to start at the beginning of Isaiah. Isaiah writes in the 8th century BC, in a time when Israel is facing increasing pressure from her neighbors, and most of all, Assyria, the global superpower of the day. In the face of mounting pressure, Isaiah is summoning the people to trust in the living God, who they cannot see, rather than military alliances with Egypt or Israel's own military ingenuity. And Israel is failing to look to God for their security and significance. And instead, they are looking to the gods of the nations to make everything okay, to make life work for them. This is what it says, Isaiah chapter 1, verse 2 and 3. Listen, heavens, and pay attention, earth, for the Lord has spoken. I have raised children, that's Israel, and brought them up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows its owner, and the donkey its master's feeding trough, but Israel does not know. My people do not understand. In response to God's redemption from Egypt and his gracious gift of the promised land, Israel had turned their back on God, not even attaining to the moral character of a donkey, who at least goes back to its master at the end of the day. In response to this, God had disciplined Israel. Isaiah 1, verses 5 and 6. Why do you want more beatings? Why do you keep on rebelling? The whole head is hurt, and the whole heart is sick. From the sole of the foot even to the head, no spot is uninjured. Wounds, welts, and festering sores, not cleansed, bandaged, or soothed with oil. This is powerful imagery. That's what it is. It's imagery. Wounds, welts, open sores. God's discipline was so that they would turn back to him. But Israel's choice is destroying them. In reality, Israel faces several horrendous things. They face the injustice, conflict, and poverty that resulted from their own choices. They face God's active discipline in their own lives, using the surrounding nations to do that. And they face the terrible excesses of siege warfare, which were horrendous, and that God will later condemn. Like refugees fleeing war, they have experienced things that they ought not to experience. Their life was an open wound, actually, because of their sin and the sin of others. And if God had not preserved this people, Israel, for himself, they would have been completely wiped out. Everything was not getting better. Everything was not going to be okay. And many were struggling to understand, where is God in the midst of these things? How is God ever going to keep his promises to his people? This is the message of Isaiah 1 to 39 in a nutshell. God promises a people that he will keep them for himself, but it will be an excruciating journey. And when we understand this and we turn to Isaiah chapter 40, verses 1 to 11, we understand Isaiah's words. So I'm going to read now Isaiah chapter 40, verses 1 to 11. It says this: Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and announce to her that her time of forced labor is over. Her iniquity has been pardoned, and she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. A voice of one crying out, prepare the way of the Lord in the wilderness. Make a straight pathway or a highway for our God in the desert. Every valley will be lifted up, and every mountain and hill will be leveled. The uneven ground will become smooth, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of the Lord will appear, and all humanity together will see it, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken. A voice was saying, cry out. Another said, what should I cry out? All humanity is grass, and all its goodness is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flowers fade when the breath of the Lord blows on them. Indeed, people are grass. The grass withers, the flowers fade, but the word of our God remains forever. Zion, herald of good news, go up on a high mountain. Jerusalem, herald of good news, raise your voice loudly. Raise it. Don't be afraid. Say to the cities of Judah, here is your God. See, the Lord comes with strength, and his power establishes his rule. His wages are with him, and his reward accompanies him. He protects his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them in the fold of his garment. He gently leads those that are nursing. We're going to work through this passage. We're going to see three things this morning. One, that God's love is tender. Two, that God's love is trustworthy. And three, that God's love will bring transformation. Let's begin with verses 1 and 2. These verses begin with God reaching out to a people who'd been broken in exile. They've seen what the mess of their sin and what Babylon's sin does. And so God draws them near to comfort them. Notice the repetition, comfort, comfort my people. And comfort is not in the sense of like commiserate. Oh man, that's rough. Life's rough. No, but rather it is a comfort that restores and actually reaches in to the difficulty and brokenness of the situation. After all, they are his people, he is their God, and he has committed themselves to him. But what exactly is being spoken about in these verses as a comfort? And who is speaking? It's some complex in this passage. There's different voices here, but it's probably best to see Isaiah the prophet being recommissioned. He had been commissioned in Isaiah chapter 6 to proclaim this message of turn or you will face judgment. And Israel had faced judgment. And now Isaiah is kind of recommissioned with a message of comfort. And in verses 9 to 11, Jerusalem herself turns into the witness, the messenger, to carry this message further. But to carry this message, the messenger must speak to the heart of Israel. This idiom, speak tenderly, is literally speak to the heart, has a nuance of love, even romance sometimes. And when we combine speak to the heart with comfort, the picture is a powerful one where God has seen the horrors that Israel has experienced, and he wants to rectify those things. Picture the child who is scared, wounded, and crying, running to the safe arms of a parent. God's children may have been wayward, but he is embracing them again. What is the message? What is the message that he's bringing is that Israel's time of forced labor, really duress, difficulty, is over. And it says that Israel has received double for her sins. Now, that may just be a poetic expression, kind of exaggeration, or double might actually mean something like the mirror of her sins, what is appropriate, what fits exactly with her sins. Whatever the case may be, the most challenging phrase here is her iniquity has been pardoned. The vocabulary actually comes from the sacrificial system, when through the sacrifice of an animal, sin would be pardoned in Israel. I don't want to address that right now. We're going to come back to it later. For now, it's enough to know that they have been forgiven and that their hardship and discipline really from God is replaced with God's favor and kindness toward them. I'm going to pause for a moment and recommend two books in the middle of my sermon. It's not usually my regular practice, but one is called When God Weeps. Really just reflecting on how God responds to the really horrible things in this world. The second is called Gentle and Lowly, the Heart of Christ for Sinners and Sufferers. And again, how does Jesus Christ respond to people in the midst of pain and suffering? So I recommend those both to you. They'll either be up here or at the back. God is showing Israel tender love, these things that these books talk about. But what does that look like? What does it look like for God to tenderly love his people? Well, verses 3 to 5 may seem to be unconnected in context. What they're talking about is God comforting his people, but you have this imagery, prepare a way, and it's actually road building imagery. Roads in the ancient Near East were often just a big, long pile of dirt in one direction. That's what a road was. And so Babylon, where Judah had gone into exile, didn't really have a very good road system. And so when any dignitary or king came to an area, they would do this. They just make a long pile of dirt in the same direction to build a road for that dignitary or king. And so when it says fix or build or prepare a proper road here, it is God coming back. It's King Yahweh, the Lord Almighty, who's coming back to his people to reign. That's what the road is about. But it's not a phenomenon limited to Israel, actually. It's something that all flesh will see. All flesh will see the glory of God. God's glory isn't just kind of like a night light, some kind of fuzzy glow, but rather it is God drawing near and being present to act when he had been hidden and distant from Israel. Verse 9 and 10 actually repeat this theme in our passage. It says, "Behold our God." The simple truth shouldn't be lost here. God, when he looks upon a broken people and a broken creation in our world, when he longs to care for them, he doesn't primarily give them gifts. He primarily gives them himself. Isaiah chapter 62, verse 11 and 12 says this. Look, the Lord has proclaimed, say to the ends of the earth, say to daughter Zion, look, your salvation is coming. Your wages are with him, and his reward accompanies him. They will be called the holy people, the Lord's redeemed, and you will be cared for, a city not deserted. God will come to save his people, to rescue his people, to redeem them, and make them his own, purifying them. They will not be forsaken. These are great promises, glorious promises, I would even say. God does not turn a blind eye to the pain and destruction caused by our sin and the sin of others in our world, but rather he draws near to comfort, actually. And yet in the moment, that can look hard to believe. When Israel looked around, what would it see? Food shortages, armies several times their size, and eventually a destroyed and burned Jerusalem and temple. They weren't seeing this. In the same way, When your relationship with your child shreds your heart because of both of your poor choices. When you see a family member slowly succumbing to a fatal illness, or an estranged family member, or an addiction that seems too hard for them to shake, God drawing near in love, well, that can seem like a bit of a fantasy. God's love wants to comfort, but is it actually reliable? Can it be trusted? And what's interesting in this passage is God actually anticipates Israel's struggle. Verses 6 to 8, you have a voice crying out about how grass and flowers fade. Grass and flowers are really proverbial. Their temporary existence, especially in the Middle East, where they can grow up one day and die the same day. And it says that all people, all flesh are like that, these fading things. More than that, the last part of verse 6, it says this: all humanity is grass, and its goodness is like a flower of the field. Now, your translation may vary a little bit in how that word's translated, but its most common meaning is it's faithful love, it's faithfulness. And so goodness isn't too far off. The meaning is this: people and their faithfulness are so fading that you cannot build your hopes on them. Indeed, Israel has been anything but faithful in their relationship to God. They had wandered, and it says here that the breath or the wind of the Lord blows on them, and they have faded into exile. In view of the unfaithfulness and variability of the human heart, we may be tempted to also doubt God. But God's word, his promises of love toward his people, will stand forever. However horrendous Israel's situation is, they can trust God's promise to draw near to comfort them. But Israel is struggling to believe this. Actually, if you were to read the next 4 chapters of the book of Isaiah, it's actually mostly God defending the idea that he will actually care, that he is a sovereign creator that is able to care for his people in the midst of what seems like horrors to them. Because of who God is, his word will stand forever. You can take it to the bank. He will come near and comfort. And this theme actually shows up in verse 9 of our passage as well, where in more than one of these chapters, they're told, it says in verse 9, do not be afraid. It's very simple. Do not be afraid. In the midst of political chaos and war, don't be afraid to speak about the comfort of Jerusalem. In the midst of the staggering pain of life and the evil realities that surrounded them and that are nurtured in our world in many ways, our hearts can waver. Can and will God really come through and act? And that's why these final verses in verses 9 to 11 are so important. Really, God's love will bring transformation. In these verses, Jerusalem, God's people, are called to proclaim this message to itself and to the surrounding people. But it's more detail is given here about what actually that means. How does the love of God actually engage and address the brokenness and sin of our world? As we already mentioned, it says, behold our God. At the end of verse 9, here is your God. Verse 10, see the Lord comes. The first way that he comes is that he will come to establish his rule and do justice. Verse 10 says that he will come in might. You might ask yourself, how is it love if God comes in might? And clearly, when it says that his wages are with him and his reward accompanies him, those are the spoils of war. That's what it's talking about. So how is it good news if God is coming to make war? Well, it's good news because God is coming to make war with evil. How is it good if the love of God comes near in might? Well, let's turn that question around. How is it loving if God leaves injustice and evil unaddressed in our world? Such a God cannot be called loving. God's kingdom is the answer to the brokenness of our world. God's rule in a world of hatred subdues the evil and rescues his people. Indeed, God's kingdom and his rule is really meant to restore our world to everything it always was and should have been. Isaiah chapter 52, verse 7 says this. You may have heard this verse, but its meaning isn't always apparent. How beautiful on the mountains are the herald who brings peace, who proclaims peace. So the herald goes up on top of a mountain. He can be more clearly heard there. His voice echoes out, and he is proclaiming peace, who proclaims news of good things, who proclaims salvation, who says to Zion, your God reigns. Here, the reign of God, the active rule of God, is in parallel with good news. Peace. The word for peace is shalom, which means wholeness. It means right relationship with other human beings, right relationship with our world, and right relationship with God. When God asserts his rights as king, it is good for us. When God shows his glory and calls us to worship him, it actually restores us and our world to the kind of place it always should have been. God's greatness in our lives is God's goodness toward creation. There's a certain analogy here with the sun that I think is helpful. This is not mine. It's Jonathan Edwards. And the point is this. Imagine you walk outside. It's been a long, cold winter, and you walk outside for the first time, and it's the first warm spring sun. And intuitively, your body just responds and says, oh, that is good. And it would be strange if somebody were to walk outside, feel that first warm spring sunlight and be like, disgusting, I hate it. So also, God, when he is ruling, brings goodness to our lives. And if we are rightly ordered as people, it is the most natural thing in the world for us to respond by enjoying that. All of us are ruled by something. Something will dominate us, and God comes near to restore the right ordering of our world for our good and his glory. So many of us have seen the abuse of authority, and maybe we've perpetrated this abused authority, but God is not that kind of king. He's good. You may be thinking, well, that's a nice idea anyway, but where does it come from that God's authority is good in this text? Well, where does that come from actually? Well, if we look at verse 11, Isaiah chapter 40, verse 11, I'll reread it for us. He protects his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them in the fold of his garment. He gently leads those that are nursing. When it talks about shepherding here, the image is one of kingship, actually. In the ancient Near East, in many different cultures, shepherding was a metaphor for how a king would rule. So when we hear, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He restores my soul. It is about the kind of king that God is. But even more than that, in verse 10, we read how God's arm, in verse 10 says, his power, it's translated in this translation, but his power, his arm establishes rule. But then it is that same arm, that same power that gathers up these tender lambs in the next verse. You have the mighty arm of God picking up the weakest and the most delicate and the most vulnerable. God's tender but strong love draws near to rule and right things. Now I want to go a step further from this text. Many times in these surrounding chapters, we can read of the arm of the Lord, God's great saving acts. Well, what is God going to do actually? What does that actually look like when he draws near to care for his sheep with his arm? Well, Isaiah 53 verse 1 that we read earlier, let me reread it for you. Who has believed what we have heard, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up like a young plant and like a root out of dry ground. He didn't have an impressive form or majesty that we should look at him, no appearance that we should desire him. The arm of the Lord is the unremarkable suffering servant in the book of Isaiah, the suffering servant who would bring redemption, who would finally right things in Israel through his own suffering. It is through weakness and death that the mighty reign of God is established in our lives. When God speaks love to his people, it's not this kind of abstract pie-in-the-sky Hallmark card kind of love. It is love through the death of Jesus Christ for us. Earlier I said I wanted to postpone the question of how Israel's sin had been dealt with, how it had been atoned for. And now we come back to the question, the mighty arm of God through the death of the servant has brought forgiveness for us. Isaiah 53, verse 10. Yet the Lord was pleased to crush him severely. When you make him a guilt offering, he will see his seed, he will prolong his days, and by his hand the Lord's pleasure will be accomplished. After his anguish, he will see light and be satisfied. By his knowledge my righteous servant will justify many, and he will carry their iniquities. The servant offers up his life so that God can come back to people and rule in peace. That's what it's about. His punishment for our peace was on him. God deals with the depth of sin and pain in our world by pulling it onto himself. And not just suffering with us, but suffering in our place in the cross of Jesus Christ. And this is exactly what we read. Josh read it earlier in Mark chapter 1, where it talks, John the Baptist arrives on the scene and he says, prepare the way of the Lord. Well, who's coming? It's Jesus. He comes. And this is why Christian love and comfort is not a glib or a trite word that ignores what is actually happening in our world. In Jesus, God is drawing near to complete justice and comfort a sin-torn world. In Jesus, God is bringing his kingdom of tender love to a world that is all too familiar with the selfish and dysfunctional, the aggressive dictators and hatred. In Jesus, God is giving us an answer to these things, offering us saving promises that we would know him, he would be our God, and we would be his people. So, how do we find ourselves here this morning? How do you find yourself here this morning? Do you find yourself unsure? I have no idea what God's heart toward is me because life seems so painful. Well, he seeks to comfort my people. Do you find yourself wondering whether he really will act? Well, his word stands forever. Are you unsure about how God could really fix what you have seen or what you have experienced? Well, he will come in might to do justice, and he will come in gentleness to save his people from their sins. And he has come in Jesus Christ. The punishment for our peace was on him. And he has been raised again so that he will come again to reign, so that he will right every wrong and make our world new. Jesus has come for us, and he invites us to respond by placing our hope and our affection in him. Let me pray for us.